The assignment notice came on a Tuesday, which I remember because Tuesdays were when the water routing system on the North Field needed its weekly calibration, and I was kneeling in the irrigation trench with mud up to my elbows when the compact courier drone dropped a sealed packet on my front step. I didn't open it until I'd finished the calibration, changed my shirt, and made a cup of the dark grain tea I'd been growing in the East Strip for the last 3 seasons. Davin Marsh, the packet's label said, Reach Colony 7, Homestead Parcel 14 Delta, Territorial Registry Number 7 Reach 4412 DM. Then below that, in the compact's formal font, Assignment Notice Compact Political Asset, Tier 3 Disposition. My authorization countersignature, required within 14 standard days. I'd heard of disposals. Every colony homesteader on Reach 7 knew about them. The Aevhari Compact had been managing its political surplus for a long time. Lower-tier royals who'd run into legal trouble, second and third daughters past their match window, functionaries whose departments had been dissolved. The Compact called it Tier 3 Disposition, which meant they were placing someone they didn't want with someone they thought wouldn't complain about receiving them. Most colonial recipients got a bureaucratic aide or a functionary. A few got low-rank cousins of minor court lines. I opened the inner sleeve and read the full document. Surith Onavil, it said, third daughter online Aevhari Compact Senior House, age 26 standard years. Status, declared medically infertile Compact Medical Tribunal ruling 7 Avil MT 0044, filed 22 months prior. Succession rights, revoked. Political classification, non-viable, Tier 3 disposition, effective upon countersignature. The Compact retained a voiding option for 24 months from date of assignment, executable under Compact Statute 19, Clause 7, return of asset in the event of disposition, misconduct, non-utilization, or administrative review. At the bottom, in smaller text, the asset is of no further political, succession, or ceremonial value to the Aevhari Compact. Disposition is irrevocable under standard terms. Countersignature constitutes acceptance of administrative responsibility for the asset's maintenance and welfare. The asset. I read that twice. Then I set the notice flat on the kitchen table, finished my tea, and signed the countersignature. I signed it because she was a person, and somebody had to. She arrived 11 days later on the twice-weekly supply shuttle from Durrell's Crossing, which was the nearest transit post to my parcel, a 16-kilometer drive on a gravel track that I'd graded myself 3 years ago. I drove the cargo flatbed out to the crossing that morning and parked it in the transit lot. I hadn't known what to expect. The notice had included a standard Aevhari data profile, which I'd read once and then set aside because I didn't want her arrival to be me measuring her against a file. She was the last one off the shuttle. She was tall, most Aevhari were, a hand and a half taller than me on average, with the deep amber skin that the Aevhari senior houses carried, and bone-white hair pulled back in a formal arrangement that was already coming slightly undone at the edges from the journey. She wore a traveling coat in compact gray, formal cut, with the online insignia on the collar. She was carrying one bag. One bag for a one-way assignment to a grain farm on a colonial rim world, and the bag was the size of something you'd take on a 3-day survey trip. She came down the shuttle ramp and looked around the transit lot with an expression I can only describe as careful, not frightened, not proud. Careful, the expression of someone who has decided to maintain composure regardless of what they find, because composure is the only thing they have left that nobody can take. She saw me. I was the only human in the lot who wasn't moving purposefully toward another shuttle. I raised my hand. "Surith Onavil," I said. "Yes," she said in compact standard. Her voice was even. She had a slight Aevhari resonance to her consonants, the Aevhari senior house speech pattern which I'd heard occasionally from compact officials on the colony. "You are Davin Marsh." "I am," I said. "Welcome to Reach Colony 7. I've got the cargo flatbed. It's a 16-kilometer drive to the homestead on a gravel road." I apologize for the road. I've been meaning to surface the last 3 kilometers, but the survey work always runs late in the autumn. She looked at me for a moment. I couldn't tell what she was thinking. Then she said, "I've traveled 11 light years in a compact transfer shuttle with recycled air and inadequate heating. A gravel road won't be difficult." I took her bag she let me, after a half-second pause, and we drove back to the homestead. The first month was quiet in the way that two people navigating a shared space, with no clear rules, tend to be quiet. I showed her the homestead the morning after she arrived. The main house, the east and north fields, the grain storage facility, the survey equipment in the back shed, the irrigation trench network, the workshop where I kept the calibration tools. She walked beside me and asked practical questions. What was the harvest window for the Northfield grain? How did the irrigation routing system interface with the compact water allocation grid? Was the survey equipment current standard or prior generation? Good questions. I answered them the same way I'd answer a fellow surveyor. When I explained the water routing calibration procedure, she listened and then said she'd like to learn it if the offer was open. I said the offer was open. By the end of the second week, she was running the Tuesday calibration herself. She caught a differential pressure error on the third line junction that I'd been compensating for manually for 2 seasons without realizing I could address the root cause. She explained the fix with the same careful composure she'd used at the transit lot. I fixed it. The Northfield yield improved. I didn't make a point of thanking her in a way that felt like gratitude as condescension. I said, "That's a better system," she said. "The differential was consistent enough to model." And that was the end of it, which felt right. She slept in the second bedroom, which I'd cleared out before she arrived. I cooked in the evenings because I'd been cooking for one for 6 years and cooking for 2 was no additional effort. I asked her, the third night, what she was able to eat. She named the things the Aevhari senior house diet avoided. I reorganized the pantry. She didn't comment on it, but the fourth night she sat at the kitchen table while I cooked instead of waiting in the second bedroom, and that was, I think, the first thing that actually changed. We ate dinner together. We talked about the grain fields, the survey records, the colony weather patterns, the transit schedule from Durrell's Crossing. We didn't talk about the compact. We didn't talk about why she was here. We didn't talk about what she'd been told about me or what I'd been told about her. I thought more than once that she was waiting for me to say something that would confirm a thing she'd prepared for, something dismissive, something that would let her know what category she was in. I didn't say it because I didn't feel it, and I'd never been good at saying things I didn't feel. In the third week, she asked to see the survey archive for the East Field. In the fourth week, she asked if I had any compact standard reference texts in the workshop. I had 3 from a Survey Corps continuing education program I'd done 4 years back. I put them on the kitchen table. She read through the first one in 2 evenings and left it in a specific place on the shelf with a page marker in the section on soil profile cross-referencing. I read that section later. It was better methodology than what I'd been using. I want to be precise about what happened and what didn't happen, because the compact would later spend considerable effort characterizing it as something it was not. Nothing happened quickly. Nothing happened because of anything I decided. What happened was quieter than that, the slow accumulation of days in which 2 people in a shared space learned that the other one was worth talking to. The East Field had a second soil layer that I'd been meaning to profile for 2 seasons. A darker stratum at about 40 centimeters that the survey equipment flagged as potentially high in trace minerals, but that I'd never gotten around to analyzing formally. Surith took the core samples in the third month using the boring equipment from the back shed, labeled them in her precise notation, and ran the analysis cross-referenced against the compact agricultural database on the colony relay. She printed the results and left them on the kitchen table with a 3-line summary at the top. The trace mineral content was high enough to support a secondary crop rotation in the East Field, a type of fiber plant that the colony market paid well for, and that I'd been told wouldn't grow well in my soil. The summary note said, "The advisory you received about fiber plant unsuitability was likely based on the surface layer sample profile, not the sub-40 cm stratum. The deeper layer has better capacity." I stared at that note for a while. Then I went out and looked at the East Field for a while longer. That spring, I planted fiber crop in the East Field southeast quarter. It was a partial trial, cautious, which was how I'd always done new things on the homestead. It came in at 200% of the advisory yield estimate. The colony market agent who bought the first cut looked at me like I'd done something clever. I hadn't done anything. Surith had looked at the data. I didn't make a fuss about this either. I said, at dinner that evening, the East Quarter fiber crop came in well. "Your analysis was right." She said the soil profile was consistent with the reference data. I said, "I've been on this parcel for 6 years, and I never thought to take a sublayer sample." She said, "You were calibrating irrigation systems and running harvest equipment. There are only so many hours." That was the end of that conversation. But something about the matter-of-fact way she said it, no performance, no expectation of gratitude, just a statement about the limits of available time, stayed with me. She had a good mind and she knew it, and she didn't need me to confirm it. She just used it, the same way she used the calibration equipment, precisely, without ceremony. In the 4th month, we had our first disagreement. It was about the irrigation trench on the North Field's western border, which I'd been routing along a slight downgrade that I'd always thought was efficient. Surith said the routing was efficient in isolation, but that it created a pressure concentration in the second junction that was accelerating wear. She showed me the wear rate data from the calibration logs over 3 years. I looked at it and saw she was right and said so. We rerouted the trench over 2 days. She dug the new section herself, using the long-handled Aevhari digging tool she'd ordered from the Transit Post supply catalog, which was better suited to the soil type than the human standard equipment I'd been using. I watched her work for a while and then went and got the matching tool from the next shipment. The disagreement, if you could call it that, lasted approximately 1 evening and was conducted entirely through the calibration logs. I thought that was a fine way to disagree with someone. Around the 6th month, she stopped wearing the formal compact traveling coat. She'd been wearing it, or something from the one bag's formal wardrobe, every day since she arrived, even when she was working the irrigation trench or operating the survey equipment. I'd offered twice to arrange a colony supply order if she needed working clothes more suited to the farm. She declined both times. The 3rd time I offered, I said it without any particular expectation and then went back to the calibration log. 2 days later, she asked me to pull up the colony supply catalog and help her navigate the order interface. She ordered 4 sets of working clothes in practical fabrics. She also, separately, ordered 2 things I didn't see on the order manifest until the delivery arrived. One was a small collection of soil analysis reference texts in Aevhari compact publication format. The other was a hand-weaving frame, compact and portable, in a style I recognized as Aevhari senior housecraft tradition. I didn't say anything about the weaving frame. It wasn't my business. She set it up in the 2nd bedroom and worked on it in the evenings sometimes when dinner was done. I could hear the quiet mechanical movement of it through the wall when I was doing paperwork at the kitchen table. It didn't bother me. It sounded like something that belonged in a house. Around the 8th month, I told her about Kala. I don't know exactly why. We'd been sitting on the front step after dinner, watching the 2nd moon come up over the East Field. Reach 7's 2nd moon was amber, and it cast a particular light on the grain at the right height of the season. and she asked if I'd always been alone on the homestead or if I'd arrived with a household. I said I'd arrived alone. I said I'd been married before on the core settlement, but my wife had died of a fever outbreak when she was 39, and we'd never had children, and after the estate was wound up, I'd applied for the colonial survey program. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry about your wife." I said thank you. I said Calla had been a steady person, and I missed her steadiness more than I missed anything else. Surith was quiet again for a while, and then she said, "Steady people are rare." I said I thought so too. She looked at the amber light on the grain and said, "My sisters were not steady. They were very beautiful and very adept at court formality, and they were not steady." She paused. "I thought I would outlast them in value if not in those other things. I was good at analysis. I was good at practical application. I thought that would count for something." She didn't say anything more about it. I didn't push. But I understood, sitting on that front step, what it had cost her to offer that much. At 14 months, she told me, she thought she might be pregnant. She said it the way she said most things, carefully, with her eyes on the middle distance rather than my face, as though she was reporting a variable in a survey model that might or might not confirm under analysis. She said the medical tribunal's declaration had been based on 3 examinations over a 4-month period, and those examinations had used the Compact's standard metabolic compatibility protocol, which assumed Aevhari to Aevhari conception parameters. She said she didn't know if those parameters applied to her current circumstances. She said the Homestead Medical Unit was 15 years out of specification, but she'd run a baseline analysis, and the result was not consistent with non-pregnancy. I said, "All right." She looked at me then, direct measuring. I said, "What do you need?" She said she would need access to a current specification medical scanner, which meant a trip to Durrell's Crossing, because the transit post had a compact standard medical bay. I said, "We can go tomorrow if you want." She said tomorrow would be adequate. We drove out to Durrell's Crossing the next morning. The transit post medical bay ran a full panel, current specification, compact certified. The medical officer on duty was a colony contract physician named Vish, who I'd worked with once on a survey team medical clearance and who asked no questions about why we were there. The scan confirmed pregnancy, 14 weeks. Vish printed the certification and handed it to Surith. He was a careful, unhurried man, Vish, the kind of colony physician who'd been out on the rim long enough to stop performing and start practicing. He said, "Congratulations," and then he stepped back and gave us the room, which was the right thing to do. Surith looked at the certification for a long moment. Her hands were very still. The bioluminescent markings on her cheekbones, the silver tear-track lines that I'd learned were the Aevhari grief response indicator, and which had been faintly active more than once in the early months before they faded as the seasons passed, were not active now. Her face was composed. Her hands were still. Then she said, "Thank you," in a voice that was steady in the specific way things are steady when they are working very hard to stay that way. I said to Vish, "We'll need the formal certification registered with the colony medical registry." Vish said, "I'll file it today." I said thank you. Surith folded the certification and held it in both hands, and we left the transit medical bay and walked back out into the ordinary light of the Durrell's Crossing transit yard. She stood in the yard for a moment. The morning was pale and the colony's single large moon, the white one, the one that came up in the north, which I'd never gotten a good name for, was setting in the west, and the transit yard smelled of the fuel that the supply shuttles used, which was a specific metallic smell I'd lived with for 6 years and never thought about. She stood there with the certification in both hands and looked at the setting moon. I waited. She said they were wrong. I said yes. She said the tribunal. They looked at 3 examinations over 4 months and they decided. They had a protocol and they ran it and it gave them a number and they decided, and that was what I was. She paused. I believed them, not immediately, but after enough time, after enough repetitions of the decision. I thought, they have the equipment and the methodology and the formal record, and I have what I feel, and feelings aren't evidence. I said feelings aren't always evidence, but absence isn't evidence either. She looked at me. I said they proved a negative. 3 examinations with a protocol that wasn't designed for your situation. That's not the same as knowing something is true. She was quiet again. The transit yard moved around us, supply workers, a cargo hover, 2 colony administrative clerks walking fast with their heads down. She said, you believe the scan. I said, you did the analysis. You had reason. She said, you believed it before I showed you any data. I said, you're a careful analyst. I've watched you work for 14 months. When you said you thought something might be true, I believed you had reason. She looked down at the certification in her hands. Then she said, all right, let's go home. On the drive back, she held the certification on her lap with both hands flat on it. I drove the gravel track. The amber moon was set, and the morning light was ordinary and pale, and the grain in the north field was about a week from its first cut. She said, the compact won't accept this. I said, probably not. She said, Statute 19, Clause 7. They have a voiding option until the assignment reaches 24 months. They'll use it. They'll say the scan is a colonial error, or that the child isn't Aevhari lineage, or both. I said, they can try. She looked at me. Davin, I want to be precise about this. The compact's voiding authority is legal under their own statutes. If they invoke it, I would be required to return. The child, she stopped, started again. Under compact succession law, a child whose parent's lineage is medically classified as non-viable would carry a contested inheritance status. They would want the child examined, classified. I don't want them to classify my child. I said, they're not going to. She said, you can't know that. I said, I know I'm going to file a territorial sovereignty objection under Colony Charter Article 9 as soon as we get home, and that Article 9 requires the compact to obtain a colony court ruling before executing any removal of a registered colony resident. You're a registered colony resident. The child will be born on this parcel. Colony Charter Article 9 preempts Compact Statute 19 in territorial jurisdiction disputes. She was quiet. I said I looked it up. When I signed the countersignature, I read every piece of colonial charter law I could find that was relevant. I didn't know if I'd need it. I wanted to be ready in case I did. She looked at the road ahead of us. She looked at the grain in the north field as we came up on the homestead. She said, when did you file? I said, I'll file today. The objection will be registered at the colony court by close of business. She said nothing. When we pulled up to the house and I stopped the flatbed, she sat for a moment with the certification still flat on her lap. Then she said, why? I said, because it's right. Because you're a person and this child is yours, and nobody gets to decide otherwise. She picked up the certification and got out of the flatbed and went inside. I sat in the flatbed for a moment. Then I went in and filed the Article 9 objection. The compact's voiding notice arrived at 19 months, 14 days. It cited Statute 19, Clause 7b, Administrative Review Grounds. It said the compact medical tribunal had reason to question the colonial scan's accuracy, given the original declaration of record. It said a compact tribunal cutter would be dispatched to reach Colony 7 to conduct an official review. It said I was required, under compact colonial administrative protocol, to present the assigned asset for tribunal examination within 30 days of the cutter's arrival. I forwarded it to my colony court filing number and sent a copy to the Article 9 record. Then I gave the notice to Surith. She read it at the kitchen table. She was 7 months along by then, which in Aevhari terms was midpoint. Aevhari gestation ran 17 standard months on average, and 14-month pregnancies were the early end. She read the notice and set it flat on the table. She said, "They're coming." I said, "Yes." She said, "What does the colony court say about the Article 9 objection?" I said the colony court had logged the objection and sent a formal acknowledgement to the compact's administrative office, notifying them that any removal proceeding would require a colony court ruling first. The compact had responded by classifying the objection as a non-binding administrative note. She said, "So they're coming, and they intend to ignore the charter." I said, "They think they can." She was quiet for a while. I made tea and set a cup on her side of the table and sat down across from her. The second bedroom weaving frame had moved to the kitchen corner about 3 months back. She worked on it in the evenings while I did the survey records, and the half-finished piece on it now had a pattern I recognized from the Aevhari senior house textile tradition, the kind of thing that took years to learn. She looked at the weaving for a moment, then she looked at me and said, "I'm going to the tribunal." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't mean with you arguing the charter. I mean I'm going to speak in the chamber, myself, in compact standard, to the tribunal members." I said, "All right." She said, "You don't think it'll make a difference?" I said, "I think you'll make a difference. I can't control what the tribunal does with it." She said, "Neither can I. But I know those people. I know how they were trained and what they fear and what they won't be able to answer if the answer is in the room with them." I said, "Then we'll both go." The compact tribunal cutter arrived at Reach Colony 723 days after the notice. It was a mid-range cutter, the kind the compact used for administrative field proceedings, and it took a parking orbit over the colony while a dispatch shuttle brought the tribunal delegation down to the Durrell's Crossing Transit Terminal. There were 5 of them, 3 medical tribunal members in compact formal dress, a records officer, and a compact enforcement officer who stood at parade rest the whole time and never spoke. The lead tribunal member was a senior officer named Seth Aravelson, with the pale copper skin of the Aravel court line and the precise, surface-level cordiality of someone who has conducted many proceedings of this type and considers the outcome to be a formality. They had commandeered the transit post's main conference room. Surith and I drove out from the homestead on the morning of the proceeding. She wore the one formal piece she'd kept from the original bag, a compact ceremonial vest in dark gray with the online insignia, worn over the working clothes she'd been using on the homestead. She looked, I thought, exactly like what she was, a woman who had been working a grain farm on a colonial rim world for 19 months and had not forgotten where she came from. I had the Article 9 filing, the medical scan certification from Dr. Vish, the colony court's acknowledgement record, and 14 months of homestead operational logs that I'd never mentioned to anyone because nobody had asked. Surith carried nothing except the pregnancy scan disc, which she'd kept since the day at the transit medical bay. Seth Aravelson opened the proceeding with the formal compact protocol declaration, and then explained, in the calm voice of administrative certainty, that the medical tribunal was convening to review the accuracy of a colonial medical assessment that appeared to conflict with an on-record compact medical tribunal ruling. He said the compact's position was that Compact Medical Tribunal Declaration 7 Avalm T0044, filed 21 months prior, constituted the operative medical record, and that the colonial scan was to be considered a preliminary finding pending compact verification. He looked at me. He said, "You are the assigned disposition recipient, Davin Marsh." I said, "I am." He said, "You have filed a colonial charter objection." I said, "Article 9, Colony Charter. I filed it at 14 months when the pregnancy was confirmed by certified colonial medical scan. The objection is registered with the colony court." He said, "The compact considers that objection non-binding in matters of compact administrative jurisdiction." I said, the colony court disagrees. So does the charter. He set that aside and moved to the medical review. He called his medical tribunal member, a physician named Aevhari Khan, to present the original declaration. Aevhari did so in the practiced cadence of someone summarizing a document they've summarized many times. He described the 3 examinations. He described the metabolic compatibility assessments. He used the word conclusive twice. Then Surath spoke. She didn't ask for permission. She said, the 3 examinations you are citing use the Compact's standard metabolic compatibility protocol, version 6.2, which models Aevhari to Aevhari conception parameters. I am not in an Aevhari to Aevhari pairing. The protocol's applicability to cross-species conception had not been reviewed or established at the time of the examinations. I have the protocol's technical reference document here. She held up a data chip. Section 4, subsection 12, footnote 3 specifies that the protocol is not validated for cross-species assessment. This is a compact published document. I'd like to enter it into the proceeding record. Seth Aravalsan looked at the data chip. He looked at Aevhari Khan. Aevhari said, the protocol's primary application. Surath said, I'm aware of the primary application. I wrote my secondary academic qualification on compact metabolic assessment methodology. Section 4, subsection 12, footnote 3. I'd like the records officer to log the document. There was a pause. The records officer looked at Seth. Seth looked at Aevhari. I said, I can enter a colony court subpoena request for the Compact's protocol documentation if the tribunal declines to log it. That would add approximately 3 months to this proceeding through the colonial court system. Seth said with the same surface-level cordiality, the document will be logged. Surath set the data chip on the conference table. I'd also like the tribunal's medical officer to conduct an in-person scan, she said. Current specification compact medical equipment. The cutter will have a bay. I'll submit to a full panel. Aevhari said, the colonial scan has already. The colonial scan is certified, and I'm not disputing it, Surath said. I'm inviting the Compact's own equipment to confirm it. Because the tribunal's position is that the colonial scan may be inaccurate, I want to remove that position. Seth looked at her for a moment. He looked at the data chip. He looked at Aevhari. Then he said, the medical officer will conduct an examination. There was a pause, and then Seth said, for the record, you are attending this proceeding voluntarily. Surath said yes. He said, the Compact's position is that this proceeding concerns the validity of an administrative assignment. The medical review is supplementary to. Surath said, the medical review is the entire question, Tribunal Chief Aravalsan. The Compact voided my assignment on the grounds of administrative review of a medical declaration. If the medical declaration was wrong, there is no administrative review to conduct. I'm saving everyone's time by establishing that fact before the proceeding concludes. Seth was quiet. The enforcement officer at the room's edge continued to stand at parade rest and continued not to speak. Aevhari Khan had been looking at the conference table for the last 90 seconds. I thought about what it had cost Surath to sit in that particular room, with those particular people, at 29 weeks, having once been the subject of exactly this kind of institutional certainty. I thought about her on the gravel road to the homestead the morning we drove back from the first scan, with the certification flat on her lap and her hands very still. I thought about the things she'd said on the front step in the amber light, and about the weaving frame in the kitchen corner, and about the Eastfield fiber crop, and about a differential pressure error that she'd caught in the second week when I'd been compensating for it manually for 2 years without knowing there was a better answer. I sat very still and let her handle it, because she was handling it better than I could. Seth said, the medical officer will proceed. The scan took 40 minutes aboard the tribunal cutter. I waited in the transit terminal. Durrell's Crossing had a small terminal canteen where the colony supply workers ate. I sat at a corner table and drank the transit post's version of dark grain tea, which was worse than mine, and waited. Through the terminal window I could see the cutter in its parking position at the end of the transit field, a mid-range compact administrative ship, gray and angular, with the Aevhari compact insignia on its aft section. Clean lines. Official. The kind of ship that was built to carry institutional authority from one place to another and to make that authority feel inevitable. I thought about that. I thought about the word asset on the assignment notice. I thought about what Seth Aevhari had expected to find on Reach Colony 7, a colonial recipient, a disposed royal, an administrative untidiness to be resolved. I thought about what he'd actually found, which was a woman who had spent 19 months learning irrigation methodology and soil profiles and colonial charter law, who had brought the relevant protocol documentation on a data chip in her pocket, who had stood in his proceeding and told him precisely and completely what the question was. I finished the tea and ordered another. Surith came back down with the medical officer, who was a younger woman than I'd expected, compact, professional, with the dark copper skin of the Aevhari mid-tier houses. She had the look of someone who had run a lot of scans and written a lot of reports, and who understood that reports were about what the data said, not about what the institutional record wanted. She handed Seth Aevhari a printed scan report when we reconvened in the conference room. He read it. He read it again. His expression did not change exactly, but something behind it did. The surface-level cordiality went still in a specific way, the way things go still when the formality has run out of arguments. The medical officer said, "The pregnancy is confirmed at 29 weeks, Aevhari standard. Fetal health indicators are within normal parameters. The fetal genetics present as dual lineage, Aevhari Senior House Online and Human Reach Colony Territorial Registry. The fetal profile is viable. I would assess the original declaration as having been conducted under an inapplicable assessment protocol." She paused. "That assessment was conducted by a different tribunal. I'm reporting what the scan shows." Orvith Yale-Khan said nothing. He was looking at the data chip. Seth set the report on the table. I said, "I'd also like to note for the colonial court record that Compact Statute 19, Clause 7b, specifies administrative review grounds as the basis for the voiding notice. Administrative review requires a material error in the original assignment. The original assignment was processed under Compact Medical Tribunal Declaration 7/AVLMT-0044. That declaration has now been determined, by the Compact's own current specification equipment, to have been conducted under an inapplicable assessment protocol. The material error, if one exists, is in the declaration, not in the assignment. Under those circumstances, the voiding notice does not meet the statutory threshold." Seth looked at me. He looked at Surith. He looked at the scan report in his hands. He said, "The tribunal will require time to review the documentation." I said, "Take all the time you need." They took 6 hours. Surith and I drove back to the homestead, ate dinner, and drove back to Durrell's Crossing in the evening. The second moon was rising amber over the transit terminal when we pulled into the lot. Seth Aevhari met us in the conference room. The enforcement officer was still there, still at parade rest, and still had not spoken. The other tribunal members were present. Seth said, "The Compact Medical Tribunal finds that Declaration 7/AVLMT-0044 was predicated on an assessment protocol with limited scope of applicability. In light of the current specification scan confirmation and the documentation provided by the assigned asset regarding protocol validity, the declaration is amended to reflect insufficient basis for conclusion. The voiding notice under Statute 19, Clause 7b, is withdrawn." He said it in the careful, formal cadence of someone whose institution has just been required to undo one of its own decisions. He didn't look comfortable. I didn't think he was required to look comfortable, and I didn't say anything that would make it worse. Surith said, "Thank you." That was all she said. 2 words in compact standard, precise, and completely composed. Seth said, "The amended declaration will be filed with the Compact Medical Records Office. The assignment record will be updated accordingly." He looked at Surith. "You are, under revised classification, a non-disposed online senior house member with a viable pregnancy on record." He paused. "That changes your succession status. The online will be notified." Surith said, "They may be notified. I'll decide what to do about it." Seth nodded. He picked up the scan report and the data chip and organized his documents. Then he stood and said, "The proceeding is concluded." We drove back to the homestead in the dark. Surith was quiet the way she'd been quiet on the drive back from the first scan, with both hands flat on something in her lap, though this time it was her own clasped hands instead of a document. The gravel track was familiar by now, every rise and dip of it, every place where the surface was rough from the autumn rains. I'd finally put down the stabilized surface on the last 3 kilometers in the spring. It was smoother than it used to be. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say in the car, in the dark, after 6 hours of waiting and 40 minutes of scan, and the particular exhaustion of watching your entire circumstances turn on the formal language of an institutional proceeding. When I pulled up to the homestead and turned the flatbed off, the amber moon was high and full, and it laid a long orange light across the north field grain. The field was in its late-season stand, tall and heavy, and the light made it look like something that had always been there and would always be there, which I supposed was the idea. She didn't get out of the flatbed right away. She sat and looked at the field. I sat and looked at it with her. After a while she said, "I want to tell you something." I said, "All right." She said, "When the compact sent me to this assignment, the formal briefing I received said that colonial rim homesteads were low amenity placements with limited social structure. It said that assigned assets placed with colonial recipients should expect a transactional arrangement in which the recipient would utilize the asset's capabilities within the homestead context with minimal relational complexity." That was the phrasing, minimal relational complexity. I said, "That's a thorough way to describe a grain farm." She said, "It was a warning, or it was meant to be. I think the person who wrote it thought they were preparing me for something diminished." She looked at the grain field. They were wrong about what diminished meant. I didn't say anything. She would finish when she was ready. She said, "You asked me what I needed. The first day. The first conversation in the cargo flatbed on the gravel road. You said you apologized for the road and then you asked what I needed." She paused. "Nobody had asked me that in approximately 2 years, not since before the declaration. After the declaration, people told me what I was and what I wasn't and what the process required and what the outcome would be. They didn't ask." I said, "I try to ask." She said, "I know, I noticed immediately. I thought it was a technique. I waited for the moment when it would turn into something else." She looked at me. "It never did." I said, "It wasn't a technique." She said, "I know that now." The amber moon was full and steady, and the grain moved very slightly in the evening wind, and the homestead behind us was lit in the way it always was at this hour. The kitchen light on, the survey record still up on the desk inside, the weaving frame in the corner with the half-finished senior house pattern that would take another 6 months at least. She said, "I want to stay here." I said, "This is your home." She turned to look at me directly, and in the amber light her pale gray eyes had caught the moon and were very clear. The bioluminescent markings on her cheekbones, the silver tear-track lines that the Aevhari carried as a grief response marker, weren't active. They hadn't been active in months, which I'd noticed at some point without quite registering it until now. She looked like herself, the version of herself that had been accumulating since the first Tuesday calibration, since the soil reference texts, since the weaving frame in the corner, since dinner on the front step watching the moon. She said, "That isn't a legal designation. I know it's not. The assignment record is still." I said I meant it exactly the way I said it. "This is your home, the child's home, that's what I meant." She was quiet. The wind moved the grain. The amber light held steady. She said, "All right." The child was born the following spring, on a morning when the east field was in early green, and the north field still had winter stubble, and the second moon was low and setting in the west. I will not describe the birth in any technical detail, because it is not mine to describe in that way. What I will say is that Vish, the transit post physician, drove out from Durrell's Crossing and arrived in time, and that the Homestead Medical Unit turned out to be adequate for the monitoring work required. What I will also say is that I stayed, because Surith asked me to, and because there was nowhere in the world I would rather have been. The child was a daughter. She had Surith's amber skin, lighter, mixed with something that the Aevhari reference text said would be the human contribution to the coloring, a warm, amber brown that sat between Surith's deep tone and the ordinary brown I've worn since I was young. She had my eyes, which surprised me, though it shouldn't have. She had Surith's bone-white hair as a fine covering, which Vish said would likely deepen in color as she grew. Her hands were very small and perfectly formed, and when she was 3 hours old, she held my left index finger with her whole fist, and that was all. We named her Kale. It was a shortened form of something longer in the Aevhari naming tradition, and it was also, not by accident, close to Kala, which was a name I'd carried quietly for 6 years on a grain farm on a colonial rim world. Surith suggested it. I said yes before she finished saying it. The online's notification arrived 4 weeks after the birth. It was a formal communication from the Aevhari Compact Senior House Administrative Office, addressed to Surith on Avil. It acknowledged the amended medical declaration and the recorded birth of a dual-lineage child with online genetics. It informed her that under the amended classification, her succession status had been reviewed and a revised assessment was pending. It asked her to indicate her preferences regarding reinstatement to the online formal roster. Surith read it at the kitchen table. Kale was asleep in the portable cradle near the weaving frame. The east field was bright green through the kitchen window. Surith said, "They want to know if I want to be on the roster." I said, "What do you want?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want them to know that I'm here, that I exist, that the declaration was wrong and the proof is in a cradle 3 meters from where I'm sitting." She set the letter down. "I don't want to go back to the court. I don't want the formal roster and the succession review and the political reassessment. I want to stay here and finish the section of the weave I've been working on for 4 months and calibrate the north field irrigation in the autumn." I said, "Then I'd write back and say that." She said, "They won't understand it." I said, "Probably not, but you'll have said it clearly." She wrote back. She said she was declining the formal reinstatement and was noting her location and status for the family record. She said the child was healthy and was named Kale. She said nothing more. The compact acknowledged receipt. The online administrator replied with a brief formal message that said, in essence, that the family was aware of her location and wished the child well. It was not effusive. It was not particularly warm. But it was there, a line that had not existed 2 years ago, from a house that had sent her away because they had decided what she was. She said it in the Homestead Records folder, between the Article 9 filing and the medical scan certification. Autumn came, and with it the Northfield harvest, and Kale was old enough by then to be carried in the front-facing carrier while I ran the harvest equipment, which meant she watched the grain machinery from approximately chest height with the focused intensity of someone collecting data. Surith thought this was a fair early education. I thought so too. The Compact Survey Service contacted me about a 6-month extended survey contract on a neighboring colony parcel. I thought about it for one day and declined. There was a harvest to run and a child who had opinions about grain machinery, and a section of senior house weave that was 3/4 finished in the kitchen corner. The contract could go to someone without reasons to be somewhere else. On a Tuesday in early winter, when the North Field was bare and the irrigation system was in its pre-season shutdown phase, and the second moon was high and sharp and cold, Surith said to me, "The calibration differential on the second line junction is drifting again. I think it's a wear issue in the pressure fitting. I can replace it this week if you get the parts from the transit post." I said I'd get the parts on Thursday. She said, "Good." Then she said, "Davin." I said, "Yes." She said, "I need to ask you something." I said, "All right." She looked at me across the kitchen table where we'd sat 100 evenings, with the survey records between us and the calibration logs and the homestead operational records and the colony charter filings and the legal notifications from an institution that had thought it owned what happened on this parcel. She looked at me the way she looked at the North Field in the amber moonlight, like something that had been here a long time and was going to keep being here. She said, "Is this what you wanted?" I said, "Surith." She said, "I'm asking seriously. I know what the assignment document said. I know it wasn't." She paused. "I know you signed the countersignature because it was the right thing to do. I know that's who you are. But I've been here 22 months and there's a child in the next room, and the compact knows my address, and I want to ask you properly whether this is the life you want, or whether you signed the countersignature and the Article 9 and did all of it because it was right, and those are different things." I said I signed the countersignature because it was right. That's true. She waited. I said, "And this is exactly the life I want. Those are both true. I want you here. I want Kale here. I want the North Field calibration and the senior house weave in the kitchen corner, and you asking me the right questions about things I've been compensating for manually for too long. I want this." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good." She went back to the calibration log. I went back to the survey records. The second moon moved its cold, sharp light across the kitchen floor, and in the next room Kale slept with the particular thoroughness of someone who had full confidence that the house was solid and the people in it were staying. I thought, not for the first time, about the document that had started all of this. The assignment notice on the front step on a Tuesday, with its careful language about assets and dispositions and non-viable classifications. I thought about what the person who wrote it had imagined about what it described. I thought about what they'd thought was a joke, or close enough to one. A princess with nothing left to offer, sent to a farmer on the edge of nowhere, both of them reduced to administrative categories. I thought the joke was always on them. The amber moon of this world sat low through the window, and the grain was in the bare field, and the weave was in the corner, and Surith Aevhari, who was a person, and who had always been a person, who was a good analyst and a better irrigation calibrator, and a mother whose daughter had her father's eyes and her bone-white hair, looked up from the calibration log and said, "The fitting will need a number 4 housing, not a number 3. I checked the specification. I said, "I'll order it tonight." She said, "Thank you." And outside the kitchen window, on the homestead parcel that was hers and mine and Kale's, the North Field lay in the winter quiet, and the amber light was steady, and everything that was here would still be here in the morning.